Okay, so on Tuesday, we talked about how, despite the efforts of the academy, of the sciences, of religion and politics since the 18th century, to get magical consciousness purged out of their institutions, we find that we've inherited an extraordinarily magical 20th and 21st century, despite this double effort. And one of the ways we described this was the ballooning of magical possibilities in the private sphere. With the expansion of private sphere, with the expansion of the consumer realm and the consumer empowerment, and the relegation of belief and conviction to, wake up. He snores so loudly. Can you hear that? It's picking up in my mic going in my ears. Okay, with the relegation of your firmest convictions, among which would be, do you believe in God? Now, the church is going to help you out with that. But ultimately, in modern epistemologies, that is, epistemologies, how do we know what we know? The truth is something that you have a huge role in shaping for yourself in your private sphere. So that is how we somewhat explained the persistence of magic in the private sphere. Now, in the public sphere, institutionally, we also discussed that science and religion have tremendous authority. And just to recap, what do I mean by having authority in the public realm? Well, you're all at a university right now, and we know that academics play a huge role in generating reports on climate change, on the safety of certain medical procedures, on all of this data that the government uses in order to implement its policies. That science in many ways is considered to be consensual, objective knowledge, the best knowledge we can get our hands on about a particular practical or technological thing, not about moral issues, but about practical things, building bridges, developing a space program, etc. So science has tremendous clout in the public sphere. Well, so does religion. It is absolutely de rigueur, if you were running for office as a senator or congressman, to invoke God at least 5 times in your speech. Obama is a sort of reformed version of a Democrat, right? Because he actually incorporated religious identity very much into his run for office. And so even though if we look at the details of it, we go, well, what specific aspects of your faith are you embracing? That gets a little bit trickier because that all gets refined into people's personal beliefs. But in the public sphere, referring to religion is authoritative, it's normative. You are not wacky for talking about your religion in public. But note, if Obama had talked about also consulting his tarot cards in order to make his decision to run for office versus consulting his family and his priest, that would have been a totally different thing. So in a way, religion has managed to become part of a really normal, mainstream discourse, even though certain atheists or rationalists would say, wait a minute, you mean you consulted some big imaginary being in the sky? Why is that less crazy than consulting your tarot card? That's what the atheists would say. But as a member of this society, we already know religion has established itself as being reasonably normative. But hold on. I've got a picture of some Jesus toast up there. Perhaps you've noticed it. Just because religion and science wield all this authority and are, have a certain amount of clout and credentials in the public realm, the private sphere is constantly, in our role as consumers, in our role as believers, constantly trying to compete with the forces of magical consciousness. This piece of toast, I believe, sprung up from a toaster 2 years ago. And there was a furore amongst the faithful because Jesus had been sighted in this suburb. Now, to get a sense of the momentum of the belief behind this, there was an actual furore. And this piece of toast got $27,000 on eBay. Now, since then, there have been sightings in like oatmeal and fish sticks and things like that that are clearly a knockoff. But when this happened, there were those who believed it was an actual miracle. Well, in a way, if you believe in a more magical universe where the supernatural, where the sacred just shimmers behind this invisible veil, something that cannot be apprehended by reason or by your five senses, but you know it's there, the fact that the Lord would be able to use toast as a gateway to reality should not in any way defy your sense of what is normal. Interestingly enough, you'd think, wow, a miracle like this, religion is going to get a huge boost from this. I'm sure like the churches must have been lining up to get their hands on this piece of toast. Absolutely not. The churches could not actually established, the mainstream established churches, they want to distance themselves as much as possible. Why? They want to occupy that position of credibility, reliability, seriousness, and still being engaged fundamentally in a discourse about God. Therefore, they have to insulate this discussion of God from all of this magic that we talked about that got banished with the 1600s and the 1700s. Magic makes you less credible. So even religion is constantly going to have to defend itself against these encroachments of magical consciousness where individuals try to assert themselves and say, no, I want religion to be this. I want to interpret my experience this way. Science, too. Take the phenomenon a few years ago. There are these parents of hyperactive children that kept insisting on the diagnosis of, oh no, my child doesn't have ADD or ADD. My child is an indigo child. You see, his frequency, his bodily energy is more evolved along the spectrum of light consciousness, and therefore he's more creative, perhaps even telepathic and empathetic, and you're just misunderstanding him. And psychiatrists were really frustrated because they found these parents really, really resistant to their ADD diagnosis. But if you were a parent, do you want to have a gifted, telepathic, empathetic child who's the next phase in evolution, or do you want to have a hyperactive child who needs to be medicated? So as consumers, we're very powerful. The psychiatrist can't actually make you go to him unless he gets a court order, and your kid would actually have to be in medical danger. And of course, there's a case that was recently in the news of a kid who has lymphoma, and his doctors feel that the lymphoma can be treated, but his mother wants to go for more naturalistic remedies, and she's working with some indigenous Indian therapies, and she actually had to flee her home because there's a legal injunction that is going to force her son to receive the medical treatment. Yet, you see, people in the private sphere are trying to claim more and more power for themselves. People in the public sphere are pushing back, trying to maintain their institutional authority. And I think what we're learning from that is these boundaries we're talking about are not set in stone. We understand they evolved over the course of the last 400 years in a state of tug of war, in a state of constant tension between the self-interest and public interest, between faith and between reason, and it won't be easily resolved. And even today, we're talking a little bit about the separate spheres. So we're talking about religion and science, both sharing the public realm, both being authoritative, both being invoked by government officials as guides to how we should govern this nation. But yet, there's probably a deeper conflict there than we realize. Can we really submerge the differences between science and religion? I understand that governmental authorities, religious authorities, scientific authorities, they're powerful. They have a vested interest in the status quo. Status quo working nicely for them. They don't necessarily want to rock the boat. But American politics are very turgid, and we see that this has become a very, very unstable relationship in what we term the culture wars, where people, many Americans, are very dissatisfied by what they perceive as the lack of a religious presence in government. Many Americans are equally disturbed, on the other side, by the horrible encroachment they perceive on government by religious forces. Americans sort of torn about this issue. And let's just take a look at that. In our most simplistic way, we talked about religion in the way we know the modernists, early modernists, and Galileo worked it out. Let nature be the preserve of science, how the heavens go. Let religion be the preserve of God, how to go to heaven. Well, those are actually going to create two very, very different types of objectives, right? One is about the afterlife, one is about your soul, one is about your material well-being. Can you really separate those things? Can you really submerge that conflict? I mean, we see that you really can't all through these hot button issues in American culture. Abortion. Well, in a way, it is a religious leap of faith to guess when life begins. Does it begin at conception? Well, then that fetus is an individual, it's sacred in the eyes of God, and has a vested right to live. Well, if you're not sure when life begins, but you think that it sort of has more and more of a stake in life as a biological organism, the more and more it evolves. So say, maybe first trimester, okay, third trimester, very bad, using a scientific criteria of how vital is this organism. And then saying, well, when it's born, then it becomes fully living. But that's a struggle that actually individuals are encouraged to come to their own conclusions. It's considered as a very profound issue that government isn't supposed to handle. But hold on. Isn't it already dragged into that debate by either legalizing or rendering abortion illegal? So what about issues of, and I'll talk a little more detail about environmentalism and foreign policy. Are we involved in a police action against terrorists? Or is this a showdown, right, of a great religious holy war that could be phrased as a crusade? Are you living for the physical well-being of the here and now? If you notice, liberals are very against physical suffering. And you can just trace that right back to Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. Liberal utilitarianism. What is good? What is bad? Good promotes positive feelings. Positive feelings in terms of well-being, physical well-being. It's good if it promotes pleasure. It's bad if it promotes pain. Somebody else who is more religious, if you ask them what is good and what is bad, something that is good promotes your spiritual evolution, which may include suffering. Something that is bad will tempt you into sin. That may include pleasure. Uh-oh. So even notions, the most basic notions of what is good and what is bad and how you're going to physically conduct your life is going to be completely engineered by this simple premise of why are you here? What is the purpose of why you're here? Are you here to serve God, or are you here to serve humanity, or do you see these two things as somehow linked? So you see this is a very, very difficult and knotty subject. I have the word epistemology up there. And this is a word we keep running into again and again. And it's basically, how do we know what we know? So we can pretend there's no conflict between science and religion, but wait a minute. Right at the very basic substructure of where they assemble their information, their knowledge, their sense of certainty, we have the scientific epistemology, which we know is about reason, rational reflection, experimentation, and no true sense that we can ever have certain knowledge. It's experimental and provisional and ongoing, guided by reason and procedure. How does a religious person know the truth? They know the truth through the Bible. They know the truth through prayer, through private revelation. They privilege faith as a form of knowing that far exceeds reason. So they're going to come to very different conclusions, the faithful person and the reasoning person, because not only do they have different objectives, not only do they have a different criteria of what is right and wrong, but they have totally different methods of how to reason. So in a way, it's unbelievable that we've been able to sort of cobble together these separate spheres occupying the public realm and guiding our lives in some kind of consensus. And it's not more rocky than it is. Now, I'm just going to finish up this slide with a couple of observations about why it is mainstream religions, big religions, and we're calling these institutional religions, often have a kind of moderated edge about them. Once that you are in the public sphere, and you're responsible for things like tax collection, you're responsible for things like education. That means you're not only powerful because you're teaching people how to get to heaven, you're also kind of powerful because you're teaching people how the heavens go. This had a moderating influence over the years on Catholicism, on mainstream Protestant sects, any of those religions that are big in the educational business, big in the huge network of church businesses, because they've got, on some level, to create a reality that's consistent enough with people's daily norms that religion can be part of mainstream society and not become a cult or something fringe, something extreme that can find no accommodation with the mainstream, so that you can still send your kid to Harvard and consider yourself religious. Wouldn't it be horrible if you had to choose between the two? So on some level, people who have very, very deeply held but somewhat inflexible beliefs that are more fundamentalist, right, and are less able to make an accommodation with mainstream society, oftentimes those people have no recourse but to homeschool their children. They have not been able to find this accommodation between science and religion and mainstream culture. They don't want to make the kinds of concessions that people have had to make to find that accommodation. Therefore, they can't go send their kids to the public schools. And in a way, we have to understand something about America that might surprise people. Why the Europeans look at us, and they're like, why are they so religious? They snicker at us because of all of the references to, George Bush makes to religion, all of the sort of, when, I can't remember his name, but he draped the Statue of Justice with the cloak to cover her bosom because it offended his religious sensibilities, the Chief Justice under Bush. So they sort of want to know why Americans have this sort of religious preoccupation, but in a way it's part of our democratic impulse. I mean, if you think about Europe in a very general sense, I don't want to get in too much trouble overstating this, but there's a stronger role for elite culture in shaping the public discourse in Europe. You can see it how much more funded their news broadcasts are, how much more funded their national public and media programs are. They get a lot more money than ours. And in a way, they have a lot more of a secular elite ethos. And think about what happened with the Protestant Reformation. A lot of these Protestant, extreme forms of Protestantism got co-opted by the mainstream, got co-opted by the rulers, and became really just other versions of the Catholic Church. In the case of the Anglican religion, kind of Catholic Church without the Pope. Elites, again, like making an accommodation because elites are in control of the status quo. But that Protestant revolution was radical. People were reading the Bible, they were reading about the end of the world, they were reading about taking over governments, bringing justice to the world. We had peasant revolts, people taking over cities and establishing religious communes. Where did those people go? A lot of them came to America, right? So in a way, America got a huge influx. It's even before you have the 18th century culture of the philosophes crafting our Constitution, which in a way is very secular. 100 years before that, you had a stratum laid down of people who interpreted secularism as freedom of religion. And your religion was so oftentimes extreme that it required you to be able to control the way you lived, control your laws, control your whole environment. You couldn't have the state interfering and the state passing laws. These are people who had a religious vision that was so extreme that in a way it interpreted its mission as not just getting to heaven, but making a heaven here on earth. You want to shape policy on earth, that's politics, right? And so that's religion that is not going to be able to surrender to this notion of secularism very easily. And then we know in the 18th century, we got people like Benjamin Franklin, who was off hobnobbing with the elites of France and had these very secular and deistic ideas, and Thomas Jefferson participating in this other aspect of American secularism, which is freedom from religion. Not that religion's a bad thing, but they tended to be deistic. And what was deism? It was the one where God kind of creates the world and then takes off, and human beings get to take control. We'll take it from here, God. You don't have to worry about us now. It promotes a much more secular kind of religion because God is absent. He doesn't have a stake in the world. So in a way, we have to understand these two faces of modernity in order to understand the culture wars. And again, what were some of the key tenets of Protestantism? Experience was key. It used to be that the Catholic Church was your intermediary between God and you, right? Was the intermediary. They'd perform the sacraments to make sure you were kept holy. They'd keep you on their liturgical calendar. And from baptism to extreme unction, they'd move you on your way up to heaven. All you needed to do was be passive and obedient. You weren't encouraged to read the Bible. You're still not very much as a Catholic. We're not so much into Bible reading. So there's a lot stronger role for the shepherding of the clergy, shepherds their flock. Protestantism, you get your hold of your Bible, you start finding fault with the priest's readings, you rebel against the priests, eventually you rebel against even the government. Remember, Cromwell's revolution was fomented by these Puritans who had a much more extreme vision of what a divine and religious life on earth should look like. That they killed the king. This is very extreme. So there's part of this Protestant ethos before it's captured, before it's disciplined by the state, that's very, very radical. It has to rejects authority, rejects tradition, and has this reforming impulse. Get out of the way, government. I am going to seek salvation on this world by perfecting it. That's my job as a religious person, not your job as a government person. Hence, what do we have in America? A tremendous history of communes and religious cults, not just building churches to go there on Sunday, but trying to establish whole towns, whole ways of life, religious utopian societies. Oftentimes they end badly. What just happened at Waco, right? That was the religious impulse, the democratic religious impulse par excellence in a way, because they wanted to gather together and direct their own government, direct their own lifestyle, make their own rules of marriage, and it was totally grounds up. And then the authorities came, surrounded them, and things ended very badly with smoke bombs and the building being burned to the ground. So it's just a different world in America, and it's just important to understand that we're having these culture wars, not necessarily as, oh, there's so many religiously backward people. It's part of the fiber of our democracy for people in, they call them low church or fundamentalists, a sort of populism. Populists who are kind of suspicious of the, how many times do you hear this term? Those Washington elites. Those secular humanists, those liberal, atheist, feminist, environmentalists. All those people can be perceived as being identified with certain elite, educated, Ivy interests that for a freedom-loving people seem very tyrannical. A sort of notion that Washington is a form of elite, educated tyranny that is out of sync with the will of the people. And out of this agitation and angst, American politics has become electrified by this religious anxiety. And we're sort of in the midst of a culture war right now. I have a couple of quotes here. One is from Pat Robertson, delivering a speech at a 1994 Christian Coalition. And he says, we are not coming up against just human beings to beat them in elections. We're going to be coming up against spiritual warfare. So this isn't just politics about what to name the main street and where to put the sewer system, right? This is politics which is about the most epic struggle. Are you on the side of Satan or are you on the side of God? Another quote you have from Paul Weyrich, who was the first to coin the term moral majority and organize that institution. We're talking about Christianizing America. We're talking about simply spreading the gospel in a political context. And Jerry Falwell, who became the leader of the moral majority, describes the movement as get them saved, get them baptized, and get them registered. This is unabashed mixing of politics and religion. But if you are a religionist, if you hold these beliefs, then you would think it would be absurd for religion to stay out of politics. Because how else are you supposed to serve God except serve him in this world? You're not in heaven yet, right? If you want to serve him, you have to serve him in this world. Then you have Tom DeLay. Remember, he used to be called Hot Tub Tom in his days of partying as a Texas salesman, but then he found Jesus and he became evangelized. So we know that he had this extreme kind of form of inner spiritual religious transformation. And I just love some of his quotes. He gets together for these, well, not anymore because he's been drummed out. But back in the day, 2 years ago, he would get together with Bill Frist and other senators for these things called Justice Sundays, which would be televised. So you have these political leaders meeting on a Sunday, the Lord's Day, in front of the TV, having it televised to 79 million Americans, right? And what sort of dialogue did you hear on Justice Sundays? Hot Tub Tom would rail against the coming apocalypse. How, and I'm quoting, this was a battle for souls, a fight to the death against the forces of liberalism, feminism, and environmentalism. Wow. That are corrupting America. Liberalism, feminism, and environmentalism that are corrupting America. Well, I mean, he has his reasons for saying that. Because once again, if you're looking at things from the epistemology of faith, with the objective of serving God, right, with the criteria that this world should be about the next world, then a lot of those things, feminism, environmentalism, do seem to run against certain dictates of the Bible. Now, I'm going to get to that in a second, but just to stay in sync with the slide here, we got a huge rift oftentimes between science and religion. There's a lot of tension along the boundary in these culture wars, and this is linked to the politics I was just talking about. The moral majority, the guy that founded the moral majority was also behind founding some of the major think tanks. Why are think tanks so important? Well, everybody knows, and you've heard it 1,000 times, academia is perverted and permeated by liberal elites. And if you accept the assumption that science isn't just about making practical decisions about matters of health, science can't help but also carry with it a moral agenda that's driven by secularism, a kind of humanism that sees you as primarily a sensual machine that should not suffer, a sensual machine that should be taken care of and should be, should experience pleasure and opportunity. It's not a bad thing, but it doesn't regard you as necessarily a spiritual human being that we have to now add all of those other spiritual considerations to how you live your life. So science, even though it's not supposed to, often people fear that it has a kind of moral baggage that it carries with it, and a way of framing your life and imposing its values. So one of the ways that the religious right tried to counter the efficacy of science and academia in shaping this debate was to create think tanks. So you have the foundation of the Heritage Foundation and things like the Cato Institute. If you ever hear these things cited on the news, and now they're, of course, left-wing think tanks and right-wing think tanks, but the goal is to create scientific studies so that you can co-opt this authoritative narrative of science and take it away from this powerful institution of academia so that you can use the weapon of science and make it an ally of your own political agenda instead of just an enemy. But I will just add this caution. These were the studies, these think tank studies are the ones that try to throw doubt on global warming and try to sort of obfuscate the issue of is smoking unhealthy for you. If you're going to set out to have a funded experiment and you have an experimental agenda, chances are you're going to be able to find the evidence you need. The reason why the academy is very much different, even though it's suspected of being driven by its own cultural agenda and ruled by a sort of secular elite, academics are very competitive and they're dying to out each other as factually incorrect. And they conduct such a large number of studies that in the end, science ends up pretty much policing itself because its members are so contentious with each other. You get thousands of studies, they need to be peer reviewed, so we really should not see any kind of factual equivalency between what happens in a think tank and what happens at the academy. And I am not saying that science doesn't get influenced by big business, that pharmaceutical research is not in any way interested by the fiscal bottom line. All those things are true. But on some level, science within the sciences itself, like the social sciences, one of the fields within history is the history of science. And all the historians of science do are historicize scientific investigation and show all the other cultural factors that went into coming to certain scientific conclusions and proving that science isn't all that objective, that scientists are just like people and that this is not a neutral form of knowledge. Notice, science is policing itself. Now, scientists tend to hate historians of science, but nonetheless, they are all somehow linked in the same academic project, and it makes my case that science is driven by skepticism. And it is that skepticism cannot guarantee us truth, but that skepticism can at least guarantee to a certain extent that we don't become terribly certain about the wrong things, that we're always looking for a better answer. And I'm just going to wrap up this section because I do have to get going. Just some more hilarity about some of our politicians. Now, what I love about Senator Inhofe is that he was actually served as chairman of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and he actually stood up there and claimed to offer compelling evidence that catastrophic global warming was a total hoax. This was the guy that's sitting on the Committee on Environmental and Public Works. Well, a giant hoax? I think that's probably an overstatement. He was citing as his evidence science that, again, came out of these think tanks. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just came out in 2007. In fact, I think they actually have even a more recent statement. And this is scientists from around the globe, and it's supported by many national institutions and organizations that are saying it's 90% sure that human beings have contributed to this. And yet, you can cite one think tank and say it's all a giant hoax. But we also have to understand some of the subtle politics involved. We're talking about that religious American believer and how individualistic that person is and how much they respect and will defend their autonomy, their right to believe and not be interfered with by the government. This is one of the most powerful forces you can tap in American politics. A lot of times you'll get left-wing commentators who are thinking to themselves, gee, it's so weird, why are all of these people of lower incomes voting Republican. It seems like they're voting against their interests because the tax situation, the health care would be in their interest. And that is to fundamentally misunderstand a part of American populism, which is we don't want the government taking care of us. Because the most important thing to us is not necessarily our health care or our finances. It's our freedom to live uninterfered with, to raise our children in the religion we want, and not to have big government. And these are the people I have written up here why our fundamentalists and the religious right tend to be so against global warming. Why do they call it a hoax? It's an attempt at a one world government. It's the ultimate bad guy, right, to the freedom-loving, sort of rebellious American spirit, this notion of not just your own lousy, giant, overfatted federal government, but now a band of authoritarianism circling the globe, right? Secular elite humanists. That's why, you know, what do they hate? They hate the UN. They hate international cooperation. I mean, you should be seeing a sort of pattern here, and how these culture wars are very profoundly driven by these anxieties that science and government are actually forces of tyranny, not servants of America, but possibly sort of ideological tyrants. Okay, and this is, I just had to have one last quote. We have another James Watt. He was President Reagan's first Secretary of the Interior. And you know, back in the 80s, when nobody was really sure about global warming, you know, he was saying, I cannot believe we're bothering this global warming thing. Look, the Earth's not supposed to last forever. Look in your book of Revelations. It's all, you know, we're supposed to get all smited eventually. And, you know, God gave us these things. It's called dominion. And we're going to use them. And after the last tree is felled, you know, Christ is going to come and smoke everything anyhow. So, you know, why should we be concerned? Now, those who don't believe in the rapture and the second coming might find this kind of person stewarding our environmental policy a sort of terrifying prospect. But if this is your outlook, you would find environmentalists totally irrelevant and, you know, perhaps in league with the Antichrist. So you see, we're seeing all of these rifts. Science and religion supposed to be sharing the public stage, supposed to be able to submerge their differences, but in many ways, this détente is very stressed and coming apart at the seam. Although in many ways, Obama is a very centralizing figure. Obama is trying to reintegrate elements of Christian evangelicalism into elements of liberal progressive thinking. So even as over the course of the times I've taught this course, we already see society in conflict, and we've seen this again and again in the 1600s and the 1700s. Thesis, antithesis, conflict. That would have been under the Bush administration. There was much more of a sense of social divide and Democrats, Republicans hating each other and faith and reason coming to blows. And what is this war about? And what are we going to do about environmentalism? And then more of a synthesis. More of a synthesis now where these impulses are going to be more reconciled by a centrist figure. And I don't have time to talk about that, even though it's interesting. And now I'm just going to quickly talk about the sort of granddaddy of this culture war, which is the Scopes trial. And I gave you an article on that, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, but quite recently, in a way that kind of shocked a lot of Americans, in 2005, you had parents going to the Dover School Board and saying, you absolutely have to allow us to teach intelligent design in your science department. Now, they didn't get away with saying we're not going to teach evolution, but they said there's an equal establishment clause, right, that you are supposed to allow alternative scientific theories to compete with each other. Intelligent design is a scientific theory. This got all the way to the courts. The parents all signed off on this. The school board all signed off on this. They bought their intelligent design books. They were distributing them to the students. Evolution was going to be just a theory, you know, one of many. in the Dover School Board. And the way this ended up getting overthrown was that the judge carefully looked through its genealogy. Where did this idea come from? And if you traced the actors back through the 1990s, 1980s, you could see that intelligent design in many ways was the heir to that original culture war between science and religion, the Scopes monkey trial. Now, the intelligent designers tried to say, this isn't an argument between science and religion. This is an internal debate. It's a scientific debate. It's two opposing scientific theories. But it became clear, and I'll discuss that in a second, why this was not the case. So we get back to the Scopes trial, 1925. Why are we suddenly having this problem that we have to have this big public trial about evolution? I mean, it was published in 1859. It seems like most people had been able to find some kind of accommodation. We don't like it, the survival of the fittest thing. It's a little violent. It's not terribly ethical, seeming on the surface. But you know what? It does look kind of progressive. And, you know, the Lord works in mysterious ways. That was key. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Because if you look at what natural selection is actually saying, it's saying, oh, no, this is not the Lord working. This is nature selecting. It's random. It's just creatures having random adaptations according to what the environmental circumstances demand of them. You know, if there's soot in the air, if it's hot, if it's muggy, if it's wet, you know, that's going to determine what kind of creatures we get. But people said, you know what, I don't really understand it. You can't explain that. How do you pass on traits that are advantageous? How do you pass on a really long pinky finger or a big nose? It just doesn't make any sense. So the whole threat of evolution was in some ways contained and submerged because no one really believed it, because it doesn't make any sense. How do you pass on single traits that are advantageous? How do you do it? Genes. And until you know about genes, and Darwinian evolution is just a big black box of mystery, nothing to get too upset over. So 1910s, 1920s, we get major advances in genetic science, and the truly materialistic implications of Darwinism come very much to the fore. And this suddenly gets people scared again and nervous again, not to mention 1920s, women bobbing their hair, women cutting their skirts off, women going crazy. It just seemed like a time of unrest, right? The failures of World War I had been a huge referendum on the status quo. The world, as people knew it, was dissolving in their hands, and then you had these terrifying arguments that God wasn't involved, God wasn't going to stop this, that we were just descended from monkeys, and I've got the genetic evidence to prove it. Terrifying. So about now, you get so much fear in Dayton, Tennessee. You get so much fear that they actually pass a law. We've got to stop teaching this evolution. It's too deadly. We can't handle it. And of course, the ACLU finds out about this, and they actually set out to stage a challenge. Since you know most of this from your reading, I'll just be quick about it. They get Thomas Scopes. He's unmarried. He doesn't have a lot to risk by being tried in a court of law. And they know he's sympathetic, you know, sympathetic figure, and he's sympathetic to evolution. And so he's sort of cast as the defendant. Now, it turns out this is a bit of a show trial. The ACLU gets the big, flashy Clarence Darrow, who's already a major national celebrity, very much known for liberal causes like workers' rights and the advocating the separation of religion and state. And then on the other side, they get Williams Jennings Bryant, who's going to prosecute Scopes for violating the law. Scopes was actually told, go teach evolution in the classroom. We want you to get prosecuted. We want there to be a trial. So they assemble all the actors, and it's really not a question of whether Scopes is guilty or not. He's guilty, and that was easy to prove. That was never what this trial was about, but it marks a watershed moment in the way science and religion are going to have to find an accommodation in America. William Jennings Bryan is not a bad guy. He was associated with all sorts of liberal policies and programs, like a very progressive humanitarian, trust-busting, anti-capitalist, on the side of the little guy. But being on the side of the little guy, being a populist, also, he embraced popular, deeply felt beliefs in creation, and he did not like what he saw happening to his society. So he went there to prosecute Scopes, but more than just to prosecute Scopes, he went there to defend God, and to defend God in this increasingly secular and harsh world. Now, the way this trial ends up going down is that Clarence Darrow sort of lures William Jennings Bryan, who is a bit of a bombastic orator and can't help himself, and they go out in a public arena. They leave the courtroom. They're standing out there in a public platform. Thousands and thousands of people have come to watch this interview because it's so highly publicized. And rather than letting Bryan actually make an impassioned plea for Jesus and for God and for beauty and humanity and faith and Christianity, and portray science as some sort of menacing materialism that's robbing of our souls, he was never allowed to make that closing argument because Darrow forwent a closing argument. Instead, he just went for the cross. And in his cross interrogation, he asked a few simple questions. So, tell me, did Jonah really spend 3 days in the belly of that whale? That's interesting. May I ask how? Oh, was the earth really created in 7 days? I understand that God commanded the sun to stand still around the earth. Can you tell me how that worked? So Darrow slipped the noose of biblical literalism around William Jennings Bryan, and that became what he got, hung with. You simply can't, in this day and age, you simply cannot fight that fight or win that argument. If you're going to be a fundamentalist, if you're going to be a literalist, in a way our culture has pushed you over to the fringes, to the side. And it's going to be very hard to get a position in science or to get a position in sort of any kind of mainstream educational context. And like I said, you're probably going to have to educate your kids at home. And this was a very kind of public failure for the creationist movement. But it galvanized a certain response. And that response was the knowledge that they too had to get with the modern program. They too had to find a way of befriending science. They couldn't beat science. They better befriend it. And thus we get the slow evolution of intelligent design. G.M. Price, he has a book called The New Geology. It becomes very popular in the wake of the Scopes trial, and it's doing something new. He's trying to take the Genesis flood and prove it by using biological arguments and geological arguments. And yet, truth be said, that's a really hard thing to prove, and so that argument kind of sits there and founders. But Henry Morris picks up the textbook in grad school some 30 years later, and he's thinking, you know what? There's something here. If I can create a coalition of scientists to help me author a textbook that is exclusively scientific, and we investigate evidence archaeologically, geologically, looking for evidence just to support things in the Bible, not embrace, don't pick all the stuff. Just try to embrace a few things you think you can win. And so they found the Creative Research Society. It's explicitly creationist, but it's founded not by religious people, but by scientists with deeply held religious beliefs. So now they're going to try to make this creationist argument, but only scientifically. They repackage creationism, and they clean it up. They try to keep out explicit biblical references, but just try to support certain features of creation as best they can, i.e., limit the age of the earth is a big thing, support the idea of that there was a major massive flood. And what they come up with is a new book. The Discovery Institute Center for Okay, of pandas. Okay, so they come up with a book of pandas and people. And at first, this book has references to creation in it. But then it struck out, and they're not able to get it presented in classrooms. And so they dissolved the institute with all of its references to creation in the title, and they refound another institute. And this time, they make sure to take all reference to creationism out of the textbook, and they take all reference to creationism out of the name of their institution, and they call it the Discoveries Institute Center for Science and Culture. Not Centers for Science, Culture, and Creation, Science and Culture. And they get this book passed through the 1987, the Louisiana Balanced Treatment Act, says, listen, you got to open up the floor to multiple scientific arguments. And many people will say, you know, evolution is just a theory. Now, it's a very good theory that's confirmed over and over again, but let's face it, it's making such huge arguments over eons of time that nobody could actually do a direct experiment over the entire evolutionary program. You can absolutely confirm direct tenets by just digging in the fossil record, and so far all the fossils they found pretty much confirm evolutionary expectations. But you can still say it's too huge a theory, you simply can't prove it, therefore it's a theory, and you should let other theories also share the arena as fair scientific debate. So, of pandas and people gets in, Baudelarized, all the creation is taken out, and they use this word, intelligent design, instead. And the Creation Institute and the Discoveries Institute Center for Science and Culture employs these very educated and sophisticated scientists. You know, they're not now trying to prove that, you know, Noah's Ark existed. You get people like Michael Behe who are making these sophisticated arguments, one of which I assigned this week, which is saying, how does evolution explain something like an eyeball? Now, an eyeball is a fantastic thing once it works. But what are you going to do with 95% of an eyeball that's still evolving? You just got a hole in your head and a spongy mass. Okay, that's just, how do you make sense of that evolutionarily speaking? You just simply can't. So raising new kinds of sophisticated queries. And intelligent design had created such a kind of scientific momentum about it that in 2005, there they were trying to get it readmitted to the schools again. But the judge went back through the record, found this book of pandas and people. Notice that in the first edition, they used the word creationism. And in the second edition, it was almost like they did a global delete but left some of the, you know, some of it out, and so they were able to find this evidence. In the second edition, they substituted intelligent design. So it was clearly something that had this religious archaeology not too far in its past, and this is what they've got now. This is after they were told that they couldn't teach this in the 2005 ruling at Dover. They came out with a 2007 version of Pandas and People, and now it is no longer of Pandas and People, the design of life. It's even more hardcore and more scientific, and look at the picture. It's like all like little synapses and neurons and biological things. So, but notice what's happening. It has to continuously, religion has to continuously find an accommodation with science or influence science and co-opt its language, had to surrender more and more and more of its specific content. So to the point where we get to this highly scientized argument that won't even reference creationism. But the historical genealogy of it comes out of that exact same impulse. And here's Richard Dawkins, who's noted the encroachment of science on religion. And you know, a lot of these books came out in the 8 years of the Bush administration, which were perceived as a heavily kind of collapse between the separation of church and state. And you had the sort of defensive textbooks coming out like The God Delusion, where Dawkins said, faith is the great cop-out. The excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence, a kind of mental illness, one of the world's greatest evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. So, I know. So now, is Richard Dawkins going to run for office on that slogan? No. In fact, Richard Dawkins is creating a very, overstating things. In a way, he's going to sell more books. It's very polemical. But this argument mostly happens on the fringes. The fringes is between extreme fundamentalists and extreme atheists. And the people in the middle who like the status quo, who want, you know, a little bit of God, a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of holiness, a little bit of secularism. That's sort of the majority in the middle. But we have to understand that perhaps that sort of compromise is only possible in a way because of certain types of compromise. And if you really think about it, here I have to speed this up. Sorry. Well, what is some of the stuff that science is telling us about human beings? And a lot of this comes out of genealogy. And if you've looked at like the sociobiology, it's trying to sort of take all of these human traits and reduce them to like genetic influences. So even, have you heard of that term, the God gene? So all of this spiritual aspiration to God, it's just evolutionarily encoded into your genetic predisposition because you have a greater chance of survival if you believe in God, so you are psychologically predisposed towards belief. So that seems rather overreaching on the part of science. Also, homosexuality in a biblical interpretation would be looked at as, you know, a depraved sin. But in science, you know, it's been associated with several different genetic markers at this point. Even things like spiritual impulses, you would think of kindness and goodness. Have you ever seen, there's been a few articles out about altruism and showing that in game theory, our species will do better if we promote some kind of altruism. So it's not the force of goodness, it's not an impulse towards God, it's not aspiring to something greater. It's all about that horrible, reductive, materialistic impulse of survival over and over again. You think you're in love, you just like someone's BO. So, you know, science has a way of encroaching on some of these very sacred aspects of our mystery, of our human mystery. Okay, I'm wrapping it up, don't worry. I've got 5 minutes. 3. I got 3. Science has a way of encroaching on our human mystery in a way that many people feel like they can't make that compromise with science. However, I just talked about an impulse of science that in a way is extremely reductive and extremely materialistic, and more gobbling up the mystery of life, wherein resides the sort of secret expectations and questions we have about God and an afterlife. But hold on. There's a whole other side of science that is coming to the fore now. Now, this is not necessarily approved of by mainstream science, but there are quite a few very official sounding, you know, investigations of things like the afterlife, the influence of prayer on fertility, the influence of prayer on the outcomes of surgery, that are not sponsored by little think tanks, but coming out of major universities, right? Columbia and Boston and University of Massachusetts. So here's one book that came out, What Happens When We Die. And this guy, Dr. Sam Parnia, got 11 major hospitals to participate in this study. And what he did is he took all of these sort of, I think, placards and objects and pieces of writing, and he hid them in hospital rooms so that you can't see them unless you're floating out of your body during surgery and looking down at the amphitheater. Now, this is, the results are not in, but the important thing here is he's a doctor, and he got 11 hospitals to agree to put this stuff in major surgical centers, and that he's assuming that what he's testing is people actually having near-death, out-of-body experiences, floating up ahead, over, and being able to see what's going on in the amphitheater. Now, usually, the mean sort of science version, like the older science version of this would have been near-death experience, yeah, anoxia. The oxygen's being cut off from your brain, it forces your vision to tunnel, and it generates light, the illusion of light. So that's why do people have the same vision all the time? You're human, and human brains respond to anoxia in this manner. What about your life flashing before your eyes when you die? Doesn't that seem kind of spiritual, like moral referendum on my whole existence? No. A sort of reductive scientific view would be like, look, you're dying. You've never done that before. Your brain is freaking out. Your brain is like going through all the index cards of every experience you've had, like, I'm dying. Have I ever done this before? How do you die? And just flipping through like index cards, right? Trying to pass an exam that you're about to fail. No, not this one. I mean the exam of, are you going to survive or not? Because the presupposition is you're dying. People, that was you, not me. All right, so, and then Journal of, okay, now Columbia University has this journal that comes out and says, oh my gosh, we implanted these women with embryos and we told them to, some of them prayed for their embryos to implant and become fertile, and some of them didn't. And there was twice as many people who prayed actually end up getting pregnant. So that is like huge. However, after they published this, it turned out that some of the authors were actually falsified and that this might actually not have been a proper scientific study. But you see that there is this massive encroachment. Now, I talked at the beginning of the course about Dr. Herbert Benson. He's a cardiologist, and he directed that massive investigation, had all these people praying for his surgical patients, and it turned out that if you got prayed for, you ended up having more complications. So it was like, oh yeah, prayer was had an impact on your surgical outcome, a negative one. But I just assigned that NPR report, right? And that NPR report pretty much advocated that no, absolutely, there is a mind-body connection, not just your mind on your body, but your mind on another person's body. And people who are closely connected, and they even suggest quantum entanglement, who are closely connected, somehow their bodies remain somehow entangled with each other, and you can actually regulate someone's temperature, regulate someone's blood pressure or blood volume, heart rate. So this is Dean Radin who's doing this, and again, he's very much associated with this type of investigation. So I think NPR has represented this as more mainstream than it actually is, because this was not particularly research taken up by UCLA, for instance, nor probably will it be. But it's still interesting for us to consider, are we on the cusp of a new paradigm? Are we going to go with this paradigm where science absolutely has a very acerbic interpretation of religion and tries to exile religious and spiritual belief from all interpretation of how we understand our bodies and ourselves? Or are we going to go in this other direction where we're starting to mount these huge investigations of what happens when you die? Do you have a soul? Can my love influence the outcome of my loved one's surgery? So these are all very powerful new trends in science. Could be a fad. We don't hear about it again. Or 10 years from now, we might find that UCLA has a soul investigation wing of its medical department, right? We don't know how this is going to play out. I guess I'm going to have to take Karl Popper off your test. All right, so woohoo about that. But I just wanted to end with, we don't really, oh my gosh, I feel like there's so much pressure. And so should I just end with saying thank you for a lovely time?